With Crucible League coming soon, I wanted to look back at some of the best builds from Forbidden Sanctum. Things that captured that little spark of magic, which only comes from playing an awesome build in Path of Exile. So now, let's look back at PoE 320. Some of these builds are honestly likely to survive at Crucible patch notes. They could be League starters, or your next favorite endgame build. And others probably won't exist a week from now. So I wouldn't set any of those plans into stone yet. The first build is one of the best all-rounders I've seen in a long time, Poison Spark Occultist. Because Poison got a lot of big buffs with the curse changes in 320. Temporal Chains went from being good on paper to good in practice since it actually applied to bosses. And fixes to the stat Poisons deal damage faster meant that they were no longer double reducing your duration, the kind of double dipping that you absolutely don't want to happen. And it's great at almost every point in the game, from that starter build you need to get you through the axe, to something that can kill uber bosses, which speaking of, oh boy did this build kill lots of uber bosses. If you may remember, Poison Spark was a great build back in 319. In 320, it got even better with these changes and the addition of Nimbus. Nimbus is a new, unique ring that adds an insane amount of damage to Spark alongside every other projectile skill in the game, or at the very least any that didn't already shotgun and already deal massive amounts of damage. While putting this list together, it was a real struggle for me to not make the best Nimbus build of 320 as the video instead. First off, the downside is your sparks fire randomly, but people use Spark Nova, which is essentially the same thing anyway. Spark covers the screen, so firing randomly just means you have better coverage. This is in fact an upside rather than a downside for this build. Secondly, it causes projectiles to return. Normally, Spark will fly around the screen for a bit, dealing damage to anything it bumps into. There's a lot of more complicated mechanics here that are definitely outside the scope of this video. And when it reaches the end, it just ceases to exist. Poof, the end. With Nimbus, the projectile will return, which in Spark's case means continuing to wander around the screen, dealing damage to anything in its path. There's a very high likelihood that the Spark will collide with enemies about the same number of times when you cast it as when it returns from Nimbus. So you can think of Nimbus as not only doubling your damage, but giving you Spark Nova completely for free. Given how powerful this item is, there's a very good chance it will in fact be nerfed going into 321, but luckily, this build may be Crucible proof. If Nimbus is nerfed, Poison Spark is still good. If Poison is nerfed, then Poison Spark is probably still good unless the nerfs are really significant, and if Spark itself is nerfed, there's a good chance that it's going to do enough damage anyway, unless the skill's really gutted. It may not be the best build of 321, but I strongly suspect you'll still be able to play it if you really want to. And that's why I'm actually considering starting Spark. Spark's been the sort of skill that I've considered for a very long time. And since Poison Spark is looking very likely to survive nerfs, this could very well be on my 321 starter shortlist. But of course, picking starters or picking favorites in general before the patch notes is a dangerous assumption, one that I'm not going to make. So I might start an Elementalist into Poison Spark. I might start an Inquisitor into some other Spark, or a different skill entirely. But I might play something else. Only patch notes will tell. And if you want to know my thoughts on the reveal for Path of Exile Crucible or the patch notes, then be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss those uploads. But if you want to play Poison Spark for yourself, either because it is in fact good in Crucible, or you're looking for a build right now, then I suggest checking out Crouching Tuna's video for more information. That's where all of the clips you've been seeing are from. But Poison Spark is an endgame build. It's not really something you can level. And if you want to level Poison Spark, maybe you should familiarize yourself with one of the best leveling builds of Path of Exile 320, Poisonous Concoction. I played the build on a Pathfinder, so that's a lot of what I'm going to reference here in the video, but it's very easy to also play on an Occultist. The reason that I went for Pathfinder is I love permanent flask uptime and poison prolif. That said, if you prefer Occultist pops, then I can hardly blame you, and given how much more powerful curses are right now, it wouldn't surprise me if Occultist was actually a little bit better. Then again, capping my resistances with flasks is really strong, so maybe it's kind of a moot point. Both are good, and you shouldn't pick favorites. Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder, was one of the most enjoyable League start experiences that I've had in a very long time. It absolutely breezed through the game on no gear at all. I don't generally practice my League starts because I don't enjoy leveling, so it's always great when I can find a build that just works out of the box and I can't mess up. PC Pathfinder also came with a unique upside of feeling like I had a Mageblade equipped from day one. Pathfinder's insane flask generation meant that not only did I not run out of life flask charges for my poisonous concoction, but I was able to have 100% uptime on resistance flasks, things like Ruby, Sapphire, and Topaz, which of course meant I could use those to cap my res because they'd always be up. And that frees up a lot of resistances to use for other things. And by things, I mean big damage. Now, PC Pathfinder does have a lower DPS ceiling than some of the high-budget builds on this list, but it's an absolute dream to play early on. And if you want to do uber bosses, you can always reroll into Poison Spark, or you can just keep pushing the PC Pathfinder gear. While the ceiling is lower, it's still high enough to do all content in the game if you're willing to invest enough time and currency. And not only does Poison Prolifer Occultist Bops cause it to feel absolutely wonderful to play, you can pop Plague Bearer and just run around without having to worry at all. Enemies will melt, and you don't have to hit any buttons aside of your movement skills. When it comes to gearing, regardless of which flavor you do, I suggest getting a Devouring Diadem. Occultist can position to just take EB, and sure, you could use a Mana Flask or Life Tap. I just don't like having to mess with mana, and being able to fit in extra auras is great as well. For a couple of other items to keep in mind, if you aren't going with Devouring Diadem, do consider Elevore. It's an amazing defensive helmet that you should be able to get easily, even on day 1 or 2. For your chest piece, good defensive options include Cloak of Flame or Lightning Coil. Both are very common and not that hard to corrupt for plus gems. On the other hand, if you want damage, you're gonna either go for Covenant or Dendrobate. Covenant's a lot more expensive and harder to corrupt. Dendrobate just works out of a box. Then finally, think about using life gain on hit, adding Purity of Elements for ailment immunity, or capping your spell suppression as soon as possible to round the build out. For more information, be sure to check out my PC Pathfinder video from 3.19. Or if you just want a more up-to-date version of a POB, be sure to join my Discord, react to give yourself a community role, check the build link archive after reading the rules, and you'll find a newly updated 3.20 version of my PC Pathfinder. Now when it comes to minions, there was a lot of doom and gloom. Oh, all the minion builds are dead. You can't play specters anymore. You can't play skeletons. Even the golems don't seem to be as strong as they used to be. Was your only option really to blow them up with Death Wish? No. Poison SRS was out there hiding in the shadows. To be truthful, it's been playable for quite a long time now. It just wasn't well known. But this is another build that benefits greatly from the changes to Poison, and so it absolutely exploded onto the scene. Now, it is heavily reliant on Covenant, at least if you want to min-max your damage, but these skulls will aggressively destroy anything within an absolutely terrifying radius of your character. Because Poison SRS has way more damage than it needs, you can easily focus on your defenses. And because Poison SRS do the damage for you, the build feels great to play, even if it's one of the more active minion choices. Sure, SRS's damage effectiveness could be nerfed, the Covenant could be changed, or Temporal Change could be nerfed so that Poison duration isn't nearly as absurd as it is right now. But even then, Amanamu's Gaze adds a ton of damage, an item that might be a little bit familiar if you've ever played any of the old Spider builds. And sure, the build's gotten a good bit of popularity, but using Covenant to convert fire damage minions over to poison is a little unconventional and kinda cool. So if GGG embraces the rule of cool, this one gets a free pass for at least one more league. Though again, that's pure speculation on my part. While it's definitely more active than a lot of previous minion builds, it still feels pretty good. SRS are themselves very, very aggressive. They actively seek out and destroy enemies. As you stack poisons, even if your SRS end up despawning or dying, you're still doing some form of persistent damage. Plus, because of a fire and forget nature, you never really have to invest into minion defenses. They might die, but as long as they get those few hits off before they do, you're pretty much fine, just focus on your own personal survival. If you want to know more about Poison SRS, then do be sure to check out Balor Mage's video or Arrow's guide for more details. Like with a lot of the previous resources, those will both be down in the description. I know. You're probably saying, enough with the poison. What about something different? Was poison really the only thing going on in 320? Honestly, it kind of was, or at the very least poison plus Nimbus. However, if you want something different, why not kill your enemies with fire? Because Righteous Fire continues to be one of the comfiest builds in PoE. You've got passive damage, defenses, recovery, and kind of the ability to just go AFK. Originally, I played Righteous Fire Inquisitor in 317. I wanted a build where I wouldn't have to read Arch Nemesis mods, and I also wouldn't have to care about what they did anyway. Sure, I could read Effigy, but I didn't know what Effigy did, since I just stood next to it and it died anyway. My plan was luckily a success. These days, you can either go Inquisitor or Juggernaut. Both have pretty good clear, decent single target, and robust defenses. Inquisitor needs a little bit more gear to get tanky, but has higher damage and does so a little bit easier. Whereas Jug needs more gear to get the same level of damage, and won't really die even if you try. If I was to play Righteous Fire again, something I am actually considering for a 321 League start, I'd probably go with the Jug version. Not because I think it's better, but just because I've already played Inquisitor, so I want to see what's different. Who knows though, maybe I'll change my mind after having played the Jug. Plus, it's been a while since I've played any Jug builds. The last one was, I think, my Strength Stacker back in Scourge League. Since you're constantly degenerating under the effects of RF, recovery is the key. And you don't hit, so you're going to need to regen. Maybe throw in a bit of recoup for the more dangerous fights. The downside of this is that you're often vulnerable to no regen maps. And since RF does deal fire damage, you're quite vulnerable to minus max as well. The upside is, this build feels super smooth to play once you get it going, and if you avoid those two very detrimental modifiers. I mean, how many times have you wanted your strategy in PoE to be, I walk at the enemies and they fall over dead? That's right, RF is the looting simulator. And when it works, oh boy does it work. You can even throw in Legacy of Fury to spread your damage around within a pack. Going full explodey with Fizz conversion is probably a little better in the long run, but unless you're going to do something like Sim 30 or 100% Delirious farming, just go with Legacy of Fury and call it a day. It's 99% as good and maybe 1% the cost. Righteous Fire is the sort of build you can easily League start, and as long as you don't need to be the absolute fastest thing, it feels incredible. I especially advise this build for bad or lazy exiles, so if that's you, then do check out my RF video, or hop into the Discord for an updated POB. On the other hand, the best new build from PoE 320 is easily Cast on Crit Nimbus Fireball. This build wouldn't exist without Nimbus, and it abuses the unique interaction between return and projectile skills with area of effect secondary explosions. Normally, no matter how many fireballs you fire, only one would be able to damage an enemy, at least unless that enemy stood up against a wall, in which case the AoEs would overlap and shotgun it. But these AoEs only trigger when the projectile A impacts an enemy, which again is limited to only one, B impacts a wall, which unfortunately walls aren't everywhere, or C, but when fireballs return from Nimbus, they coalesce at a central point. For you, that means the AoE from every single projectile overlaps for massive damage. This build is played as a Cast on Crit Deadeye, with the goal of getting as many projectiles as possible while also abusing chain mechanics. And the attack used to trigger Fireball is Kinetic Blast, since that has great coverage. Remember, Nimbus causes your projectiles to be fired randomly, so this isn't Kinetic Blast anymore, this is KB Nova. And this isn't Fireball anymore. This is Fireball Nova, the closest thing you'll get to a permanent Vol Fireball. Because Palstron likes playing well-rounded builds, the defenses aren't too shabby either. And as a Cast on Crit enjoyer, I'm quite tempted to play the build myself. However, there is one very big downside. There's so many explosions, and so many fireballs, and so much going on, that you're probably not going to see the screen. But let's be honest. If you were here to read or see the screen, you probably wouldn't be playing Path of Exile. We all know exiles can't read, and no one looks at their screen anyway. Everyone's always too busy tabbed over on Reddit to see who dropped 3 mirrors. And so, if you want a great high-budget build that feels absolutely amazing, I suggest checking out Palstron's Cast on Crit Fireball. A link to his video will be down in the description below. And last but not least, the best Nerf avoider of Path of Exile 320, Seismic Trap Saboteur. Will the Crucible's hammer strike true? Will this build finally be deleted? You'll have to wait for the patch notes to find out. There's been a few ways to play Seismic Trap. Poison, Cold Conversion, Fizz Crit. Personally, I played the Fizz Crit version back in 3.16, but the Poison version is far and away the most popular these days, for reasons covered for the first half of this video. Should you plan on league starting Seismic Trap? Well, I've always said it's a risk to plan your league starter before patch notes, but in this case, I say the safer bet is to plan on Seismic Trap not being your league starter, because it's gotten away with quite a lot, and I don't see it getting away this time. Cooldown traps are about dropping big burst damage, and Seismic in particular does this because it's a series of area effects which can overlap. As a Fizz skill, you also get +3 or +6 from cooldown point, and a recipe for mass screen clutter. Though you could always go with something else, like say an Obliteration, if you want the Fizz's extra and nice pops for Poisonous Clear. This build has especially been a favorite of the Gauntlet, Solo Self-Found, and Hardcore. Now, I know at this point, there have been so many memes about Seismic Trap getting nerfed, not nerfed, re-nerfed, or unnerfed, that it's hard to tell if anyone's taking it seriously anymore. Personally, I don't think this build is so oppressive that it absolutely needs to be removed. At least, not from a softcore trade perspective. Now, if we're talking about hardcore, Solo Self-Found hardcore, yeah, it's pretty darn bad, and I can see why the racers don't want to play the same build they've played for the past... How many leagues has it been since 3.14? Sorry, I'm an exile, I do murder not math, you're gonna have to calculate that on your own. But either way, it could be time for a bit of a meta shift. Though, if you want to go back and look at how I did Seismic Trap, I will put a link down below, but I firmly believe that this build should stay in the past, at least my version of it, so there isn't going to be any update, nor a POB in Discord. And with that said, those are some of the best, or at least in my opinion most interesting builds from Path of Exile 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum. The Forbidden Sanctum was my favorite league mechanic since Expedition. Yes, I know, Expedition was a wildly unpopular league, but Expedition the mechanic was genuinely excellent. And in 3.20, there were cool items, new systems, and fun builds to try out. Some of the items, like Nimbus, are here to stay. Others, like all the Sanctum-specific stuff, are going away, at least for now. Though personally, I hope they return at some point in the future. I'm sure you've heard of a lot of the builds on this list before. Maybe you're even considering some as a league starter. But hopefully you hadn't heard of all of them. Or at the very least, if you knew about all of these builds, maybe you learned something about how to change the defenses, tweak the damage, or otherwise find new synergies in Path of Exile. Which, on that note, if you're interested in synergies and especially defensive layering, do make sure you're subscribed, as I've got a special surprise on that coming very soon. But now, it's time to stop looking at the past, and instead turn to the future, to Path of Exile 3.21 Crucible League, and all the fun new builds that hopefully that will bring. A big thanks to Palstron, Balormage, and Crouching Tuna for letting me showcase their builds. But now I'm curious, what are some of your favorite builds from Path of Exile 3.20? Either something you played yourself, which was really awesome, maybe your first Uber boss kill, or your first time reaching Act 10, or a build that you saw someone else play, which absolutely blew your mind. Be sure to put those down in the comments below. Before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Links down in the description. Now normally, this is the point where I'd recommend some other things to watch. But don't worry, the video description is packed with recommendations, including videos for all the builds I just mentioned. So do be sure to check that out. Or you can always go with the on-screen recommendation right now. That's it for me today. I'm very excited for 3.21. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.